And welcome to this Monday edition of the Pulse of Politics. I'm Aaron Jordan. Thank you so much for joining us on your deeper dive into the nightly political stories. Whether you're watching us on the big screen or maybe streaming us on your laptop or your phone with the Lions game going on in the background, if that's the case, let me just be honest with you. I don't blame you. I would probably be doing the exact same thing. But we've got a lot of headlines we need to run through right now, and we're going to do it in a bit of a different way. We're going to be adding context to them as well. And for that, there's no one better than Oakland University political science professor Dave Dulio, who is joining us tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
You got it, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
So, Dave, I want to start with the budget battle that's happening in D.C. because we know President Trump is going to meet with Senate Minority Leader Schumer and House Minority Leader Jeffries. They have less than a week, or a little more than a week, I should say, to get that budget passed and avoid a deadline. But here's the catch. They're all on recess right now. So where do we think things stand with that?
Well, it certainly seems like we are hurtling toward a government shutdown. And these seem to be getting more and more frequent in recent years. And, you know, I think that it's usually some brinksmanship, and we're almost to that point. The House Republicans late last week tried to float a continuing resolution, which, as you know, is a short-term stopgap budget measure, and Democrats rejected it, and Senate Democrats in particular, because they can filibuster and shut down any legislative activity with less than 60 votes. So, you know, it's one of those old-time familiar Washington situations, I guess, where we are in the same boat that we've seen many, many times.
And it's interesting you bring up the filibuster. That is, and we've mentioned this before, a key difference with this one versus the President Trump's so-called one big beautiful bill, where Senate Republican or Senate Democrats, I should say, couldn't filibuster that, and that's the big difference here.
It is, and that's because that was through a parliamentary procedure called budget reconciliation, which the majority party can take advantage of a couple of times every year, and this is a different process. We're going through the normal, or I should say, standard or required appropriations process, which does have the filibuster as part of the minority's tools to try and impact the process.
Well, and we've heard Democrats say they want those Medicaid cuts restored, and that's one of the big holdups. The Republicans say, hey, Democrats would just increase spending exponentially. And so at this point, like you said, it seems like we're hurtling toward a shutdown, and very well could go right up until the deadline at the very least, with Congress being off all this week.
Oh, I think so for sure. And at this point, both sides know where the other one stands, right? And we'll have to see if and let's put it this way, right? The members are on recess. They're not there. They're not in session. But the staff is working, and I would be shocked if there aren't some discussions going on behind closed doors, sort of in the hallways of the Capitol, where maybe some small movements are taking place. But at the end of the day, this is going to come down to the House Speaker, House Minority Leader, Senate Majority Leader, Senate Minority Leader, and the President working out a deal, and who knows when that comes.
Yeah, and that's what's going to be interesting, because to take us back a little bit, we saw a shutdown at the end of 2018 that stretched into 2019. I'm curious, just given where Democrats stand right now with wanting those Medicaid cuts restored, it really kind of begs the question, are we going to be there all over again, or do Democrats really stand to lose political points with a shutdown?
So I think it is all about where Democrats think they are. And, because the ball's pretty much in their court. I mean, we could have a continuing resolution to stop a shutdown that would last, 6 or 8 weeks or whatever the time frame was proposed. But Democrats right now feel like, I would imagine, that they have some political cards left to play. And as we get closer, we'll have to see. And I can't help but think about how we could juxtapose what's happening in Washington with what's happening in Lansing. And there's a couple different elements to the state budget stalemate that we're in, and I think the biggest one there is school funding, because as you know, right, that is something that is up in the air with great uncertainty. And if there is a state government shutdown, what happens in the schools? How do those school districts pay their bills? And I think that because of that, because this is going to be an issue that really hits close to home for a lot of parents here in Michigan, that we'll see that one wrapped up before we see the federal government.
Yeah, because and one of the other big concerns that they have too is you mentioned the school funding, but the school lunches are going to be impacted by that as well. And Republicans, we had, I believe, Senator Runstead on a few weeks ago on the Pulse, and he was saying, look, schools can choose how to use this money no matter how or however they want to. And Democrats are saying the school meals are just too important to not give. So it really seems like that's the big line in the sand with this.
So it appears to me that the difference in how Republicans are approaching the school budgets and Democrats is Republicans are proposing a new model of funding, so to speak, in where monies are provided to school districts in chunks without any strings attached, if you will, where the traditional model that Democrats like are smaller chunks for specific pots of money, like school lunches or after school programs or whatever those might be, right? Where the Republicans are proposing or have proposed a larger sum of money to the schools in with less requirements, maybe, where Democrats want to see dollars spent for this, that, or the other thing, while Republicans are saying, we'll send it to you and you guys figure out how best to use it.
Dave, and that's something we're going to have to follow over the next few weeks, because that clock is really ticking down. Going to be interesting to see what comes out of that. I do want to turn to the Supreme Court, because they could overturn, they're going to hear arguments in December, and could overturn a 1935 law, which could give President Trump expanded powers over independent agencies. You are so good at breaking down these complicated issues. What's at stake here?
Well, the first thing I think we need to think about is an independent agency, right? And these are government agencies that are, they get their staff, basically, they get their folks through presidential appointment and through Senate confirmation. However, they are supposed to sort of cut ties, if you will, from the federal government's influence after that. So we're talking about the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, right, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And, what the president wants to do is get rid of some of these folks that have been working at these different agencies. And until now, the courts have they stood on precedent back to, as you say, 1935, where Congress has a bit more power and authority in figuring out whether or not somebody can be dismissed from their job. And I think the president's argument is, these folks go through the confirmation process and are technically part of the executive branch, even though they are these independent agencies, and that he should have an ability to clean house.
Well, and that's such an interesting thing to me too, because you hear he's trying to fire the Democratic member of one of these boards that you're talking about. And right now, it's pretty limited as to when he can fire them to neglect of duty or it's things like that.
We often hear this, for viewers out there. Think about when a high profile coach is going to get fired, right?
Yeah.
Or somebody like that, right? If they are fired for cause rather than for just winning or not winning enough games, for cause would get that coach fired without having to owe them the rest of the contract, right?
Yeah.
President Trump wants to fire some of these folks for cause, which is what he is permitted to do in the law. And the squishy part, right? The part that's up for interpretation is, at least in part, what does for cause mean? And I think there's another element to it which we talked about, which is, well, I don't like how they're doing their job. I want them out.
Right, and you're seeing that right now with the Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, who there are these claims of mortgage fraud.
Yeah.
But she's coming back going, no, not so fast. This is political. These charges are, no pun intended, just trumped up.
Right. And, that's another great example, I think, of we have disputes all the time in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when one American doesn't like what another American does, they sue them, right? So,
yeah.
We have a pretty litigious society, but those kinds of interpretations and disagreements and disputes spill over into politics all the time. As we've been talking about, they can be over, these allegations. They can be over, how somebody is viewed in terms of their job performance, and it's up to the courts to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's interesting with this Supreme Court in particular, because it's a court that hasn't been afraid to say, this previous ruling was wrong, this previous court was wrong, and they've even gone as far to imply that President Trump could have the powers to really reshape these boards. So that, I think, is an element of this as well.
Absolutely. And, I think that the court has seen some pretty high profile, emotional, divisive, maybe even, and it's tough to use that word for the Supreme Court, which has traditionally not been like that. But
Mm-hmm.
when you start to deal with, let's go back a couple of years to the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade.
Yep.
We really get to the heart of that. But then, there have been so many court cases involving President Trump and actions that he is trying to take. And is he pushing the envelope? Absolutely. Is he trying to take the federal government, the executive branch, into areas that it's not been before? Absolutely. And we're left with the 9 justices to try and figure some of this stuff out.
And even go back to last year, the ruling where they said, hey, he has broad power, broad immunity, I should say, for his actions while he's taken in office. So that could maybe be another sign of how this court's going to rule. Again, we're just going to have to wait and see. Finally, I want to talk to you about these new media restrictions that the Pentagon is putting into place, requiring journalists to essentially sign a pledge saying they won't report unauthorized info and they could lose access. Obviously, this is something that's being denounced by press advocates. Is this something we've seen before, Dave?
This one's, for all of the things that we've talked about over the months and years, Aaron, right? I mean, these are some of the most intriguing, thought-provoking questions and issues that are out there, because we are wrapped up in, as is often the case with politics, complex and multi-layered issues and questions, right? And this is another one, I think, because it is illegal to put out unauthorized or classified material.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have the First Amendment that talks about, not abridging the freedom of press, right? So There are, I guess, the freedom of the press seems to me, and I'm no constitutional law expert, right? But it seems to me that the freedom of the press, like the freedom of speech, which has also been in the news lately, is not something that can't be limited, right? Because as we said, right, the journalists, it is illegal to release sensitive, classified information. And now, and when I first read about this, that's where my brain went to. But that might be a limited view of it. But I think we have to think about it both in the context of what are reasonable, maybe, and you can hear the doubt in my voice, right? I mean, what are reasonable limitations on rights that oftentimes get talked about as unequivocal?
Absolutely. And just so many questions, so many constitutional questions we've been dealing with since this presidency started. And those seem like they're only going to continue as we roll along in the next few months, weeks, and years. Dave Dulio, always great to have you sorting it out with us. Thank you so much for taking the time and being here tonight.
You got it.
So we do have some late-breaking developments with the Jimmy Kimmel situation. We are going to get to those, and we're going to talk with Pulse anchor Roop Raj coming up next. You're watching The Pulse of Politics. Welcome back, everyone, to The Pulse of Politics. I'm Aaron Jordan. Some late-breaking developments in the Jimmy Kimmel Live situation. ABC has reinstated him, but there's a catch, and that's where I'm going to bring in Pulse anchor Roop Raj. Roop, we're still waiting on a comment from Nexstar Media Group, which is the major station owner that really kind of prompted all of this, saying, hey, we're not going to air it after those comments about Charlie Kirk. Sinclair Broadcast Group was the other one. They said they're still going to be preempting the show. They will not be airing it starting tomorrow night. They'll be replacing it with news programming. And they're talking with ABC about bringing it back at some point, possibly. So a win for Kimmel, but there's a catch to that as well.
Well, I think it's going to be a messy road back for Kimmel to get back to his full market exposure or saturation that he had, as they say in the business world. Look, here's the bottom line. Some things were said that shouldn't have been said on television. Did it violate FCC rules? No. Did it bring about enough, I guess you could say, of a protest by many that it brought to light perhaps more than an apology, but some kind of finger wagging from the head of the FCC, all in the midst of mergers that are in the works right now that made, I think, these companies, as you know, a little more cautious. Sure, all of those things are true. But what's also true is you have to see where Kimmel does well. Is he doing well in Grand Rapids compared to Detroit? Is he doing better in West Illinois as he is in Eastern Massachusetts? You have to see which markets he does well in. And those markets, we're going to have to take a close look at a business position and look at whether or not, or whether rather there is viability to the show. And if they believe in certain markets that, look, this show is doing really well here, and now that ABC is saying, look, we're not suspending him, we're bringing him back, then maybe we should just air the show. But that's a pretty calculated decision for Sinclair to say we're not doing it yet.
And that's such a fascinating question because it does impact, the Sinclair decision impacts the Traverse City market. The fact we're still waiting again on whether Nexstar is going to bring it back at this point. That impacts viewers in Lansing and the Grand Rapids markets. So it really is just, like you said, it's a fascinating question to see and just really curious about, I wonder if they're waiting maybe to see how Jimmy Kimmel handles it when he's back tomorrow, because we're seeing reports that he's going to address it. What is he going to say? Maybe that's what they're waiting on. It's just hard to say at this point.
You're right. That could guide the decision, and likely it will have a big part in it. I mean, if he does a big mea culpa and say, hey, I shouldn't have said what I said, that was wrong. My thoughts are with Charlie Kirk's family and wife and children. And when anyone is murdered, we shouldn't be politicizing it right away, even though this was a politically vocal guy. This is the end of his life. Someone was killed in cold blood. And instead of assuming we think we know who did it soon after, we shouldn't be doing that. I was wrong to do that and move on. Hey, maybe that's all this is needed here. Stopping and actually saying, having an about face about any mistake you make, whether it be on television or off in any business, is good business. Because at some point, in journalism, when publications make a mistake, they recognize it. If there are reporters who say awful things at a TV station, the station recognizes it.
Yep.
It says, we apologize for how this made people feel. He's the face of this show. What will he say? We'll watch carefully tomorrow night.
And contrition really tends to go a long way when it comes to resolving issues just in general, like you said, whether it's on TV or off. And it's a really, I think, could be key to bringing back that decency, that civility that you and I always talk about, is just being willing to admit, hey, I was wrong here, and apologizing for your actions, just being forthright about it.
You're right, Aaron. Modeling the behavior that we're asking everybody to follow, whether you're red or blue, Democrat, Republican, whether you're, wherever you are on the political spectrum, that level of decency, that bar should be at a place where you leave it there and you say, we're not going to go below this space. And what we talked about on the Pulse tonight was about that political temperature, but really about empathy. And have we lost all semblance of empathy? What is empathy anyway? It means like something bad happened to someone. Can you put aside your differences and say, man, I feel this is terrible that this happened to this person, and just leave it there? Or do you jump right into the political spectrum and say, I can't believe this person used to say these terrible things. Oh, and by the way, yeah, I guess it's terrible that he died. And we've seen this on both sides. I mean, unfortunately, we've seen some terrible things being said about people who are on the left. I mean, after Joe Biden, the president, was diagnosed with cancer, and in the hours afterwards, there were certain figures that were asked about it, and they said things like, how come his wife, who's a doctor, didn't realize that he had he said 5 cancer. There's no such thing as stage 4 cancer. Someone else was quoted as actually saying, it doesn't look like a good diagnosis, but he didn't do a good job as president.
Right. One should have nothing to do with the other.
Nothing to do with the other. If someone is diagnosed with cancer, someone is murdered, those things alone should be the only thing you discuss, at least for a short time. And that's where the decency line is. And that's what we were talking about on the Pulse tonight. Have we broached that? Have we breached that? Have we gone to a place where we're no longer able to do that?
And it really almost seems like we've lost that when it comes to politics, especially because when you look at normal human interactions, say there's someone that I don't necessarily get along with in anywhere, but they needed help, and I was there and was able to help, I would help them even if I don't get along with them, because that's human empathy right there, just decency that we talk about. But it seems like when it comes to politics and it comes to the discourse that we have, like you said, those awful things said about President Biden, or the jokes made about Paul Pelosi after he was attacked, versus Charlie Kirk with the situation we've seen in dialogue the last few weeks. We've really lost that on both sides of the aisle, and that's sad to say, and we really need to get that back.
Yeah, Dave Dooley and I were talking just moments before he was on your show about how, we have such short memories. Like, we don't really think that deeply about things. It's always like, what was on our social media feed today? But one thing in journalism that we try to do is give you context, and that context means looking at a little bit of history. And you don't have to go that far back to find that this terrible rhetoric of demonizing people after they die is something that should never be done, but it's done all the time. And it's done by people of all stripes. But the bottom line is, it's not a Republican-Democrat thing. It's a human thing. But we got to find a way to be a little more decent with the way we handle each other's pain.
Both sides are guilty, but it really comes down to a morality issue for those people that are making those types of statements. And the biggest thing that we need to say is, it's not the majority of people that do that. There are so many people out there, and we have them on the Pulse all the time, that are able to disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah,
but it's also up to the people, that silent majority, to really overcome the loud minority and say, this is not who we are, this is not what we stand for.
I think it's great. Like, Jason Cable Rowe is an unapologetic, and no one should have to apologize for any of their politics, but he's a very passionate, unapologetic conservative. And he is someone who believes that when people vilify everything that Charlie Kirk says, they're vilifying him. And he said that on our air today. He also, on the Pulse tonight, will talk about how, as a Republican and as someone who's a conservative, he condemns terrible things said by conservatives and by Republicans, because it's not a very virtuous thing to say, no matter what someone says of my political affiliation, I will defend until I die.
Right.
Obviously, these are human beings, on Democrats and Republicans. You don't have to honor everything that everybody says. in your party. And I think that's where Jason Kimmel comes in to say, I don't fall in line with politics as usual. He says, I condemn the things that President Trump has said in the past. Jason Kimmel has said that, hey, I don't agree with these things that this president said, but I do agree with these policies. So it's okay to say, I take a little bit of this, but not all of this. But we have this kind of like this weird allegiance on both sides, I think it's safe to say. People would criticize Kamala Harris during the campaign. You and I saw this.
Yeah.
And they would just get lambasted on our air. How can you make fun of her? She's our person, our chosen one.
And you would get accused of horrible things, like of sexism, racism, whatever the case may be, when people were simply criticizing policies and criticizing the campaign.
A good example. I was on a panel back in a policy conference in May, and I was moderating a discussion with April Ryan and S.E. Cupp. And they were talking about Kamala Harris. And so I brought up that, so here are the mistakes that the VP, Kamala Harris's campaign made. Not recognizing Biden's mistakes, not coming out to differentiate yourself with Biden. And one of the panelists turned around and said, April Ryan said, I don't like that you're picking on someone who's a black woman. And my response to that was, I'm an Indian guy, right? I'm Indian American.
Right.
Kamala Harris is half Indian. In fact, she was mostly raised by an Indian mother. And so I turned around and I said, well, April, to be fair, yes, she's a black woman, but she's also an Indian woman. And I wanted to point that out because we so easily fall into this line of saying, no, this person is this, therefore you can't say anything. Look, she's Indian, she's black, she's a woman, she's a person, she's an American, she's a politician who's running for the highest office in the world. You better believe we should be holding her feet to the fire and having high scrutiny for all the things that she says and believes and stands for.
Yeah.
The same way we would do for a white conservative woman or a black conservative woman or a white man. It's really, really important.
Absolutely. And they're all held to the same standards. They're all under the microscope. And it's
Absolutely.
just an important conversation to have as well.